From Built It Productions, it's The Great Creators. Conversations about creativity with some of the most celebrated actors, musicians, and performers of our time. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, comedian Nick Kroll on finding his voice through writing.
When I realized that I write verbally, my creative output grew exponentially.
So much so, Nick grew into one of the most beloved comedians working today. Nick Kroll first got famous playing a very specific type of role, a character who's a bit vulgar, overconfident, painfully lacking any self-awareness, and cringe-inducingly funny. Turned on the TV anytime in the 2010s, and there was Nick on shows like Parks and Recreation, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, Community, and The League, performing that character to perfection. But over time, his work and his craft evolved into not just different characters, but work behind the scenes as a writer and director. His sketch comedy series Kroll Show built a cult following that lives on in viral YouTube clips. He voiced Gunther the Pig in Sing. He's written an off-Broadway play and co-created 2 animated shows on Netflix, Big Mouth, loosely based on his own teenage years, and a spin-off called Human Resources. On this episode of The Great Creators, we'll find out how and where Nick gets his ideas, why you might want to consider improv classes to boost creative thinking, his process for writing comedy, and Nick's surprising take on the idea that comedians can't say anything anymore for fear of getting canceled. That's all coming up after this quick break. Hey, before we continue with the show, just a quick note. I already hinted that Nick Kroll's comedy can be a bit edgy, and I wanted to let you know that there are a few adult references in today's episode. So just a heads up if you're listening with kids nearby. Okay, thanks so much, and let's get back to the show. If there's one popular myth about professional comedians, it's the idea that they're all working through some kind of early trauma, that a difficult childhood or a dysfunctional family is somehow a prerequisite for getting on stage and making strangers laugh. But Nick Kroll doesn't really fit that mold. He grew up in the suburbs outside New York City. His dad founded a hugely successful consulting business, and Nick describes his family as loving and supportive, especially because Nick was, not surprisingly, the class clown in the Kroll household.
My family has a very clear memory of me, probably like 5, sitting at the dinner table with a mouthful of milk, waiting for my brother to say or do anything so that I could spit it out laughing. I also have a memory being on like a family trip, I think to Israel, when I was probably like 11. And you know, when you're in those like larger vans on when you're on a big trip and you have like a van and there's a tour guide with a little mic in front, and I remember grabbing the mic and doing Andrew Dice Clay jokes for my family on a trip to Israel when I was like a 10 or 11. So yes, I think I was always kind of performing for my family, and then bringing that into school or camp or wherever I was definitely always trying to kind of find the spotlight a bit.
When did you first start to think about performing in a more formal way, like, you know, trying out for plays and getting into theater and drama?
I was sort of like, I think I mentioned it, you know, summer camp, like a lot of, for those who are not like upper middle class Jews, a lot of we went to summer camp, and there was campfires every week, or lip sync competitions. I would sort of weasel my way into those, and then in middle school I hosted a lot, and I did a few plays in middle school and elementary school. I was the Pharaoh in a second grade production of Exodus from Egypt, the first of my many roles as a over the top villain. I was Ali Hackham, the swarthy Persian peddler in Oklahoma, both in my in my middle school, and then the following year again at my synagogue. This is turning into a very Jewish interview. My apologies to everyone. But then by high school, I kind of fell off from performing a ton. It was not, frankly, it was not valued amongst my friend group and my high school. And so I retreated a bit in high school. And then when I got to college, I really started, I took a swing at it.
So when you got to, because I know you went to Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and I have to imagine that, I mean, I lived in Washington, D.C. I lived not too far from Georgetown many years ago. And it's a really serious school. I mean, it's full of a lot of really ambitious kids who want to go into politics or finance or law or nonprofit, very idealistic, but a very buttoned up place, even to this day. And I mean, when you got there, you're surrounded by these kinds of sort of type A kids. What was your ambition? How did you fit into that?
I really didn't think when I was a kid through high school and even at the beginning of college, like I was like, I love performing, but I didn't think one could become a performer or that I could. It was something that other people did. It just didn't seem like in the realm of possibility that I could go be a professional comedian. It just didn't seem real. But I got to college and I saw a flyer that was for a thing called the funniest act on campus, sort of a normal college kind of activity. And I went and performed. I did it. And it was at Gaston Hall, which is this really beautiful theater at Georgetown. And
I've been there for High Holy Day services.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, even they cover up all the
They do.
And,
that's very nice. It's a very inclusive. It is ultimately a very inclusive place.
Yeah.
It's and I got there. I frankly got a little intoxicated because it turned out I was actually quite nervous about it. The whole bit was that I was going to get on stage and say, "Boy, I thought I was going to be so nervous, but I'm actually totally relaxed," and then I was going to piss my pants. And I did not have faith that I was going to be able to piss my pants on the spot. So I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll bring a water balloon and I'll bring a pin, and then I'll sort of poke the water balloon, and then I'll sort of slowly. Anyway, I then got a little intoxicated because I, in fact, was quite nervous about it.
Yeah.
And then I showed up at the venue and realized I had forgotten the water balloon. I'd forgotten the pin. So I grabbed a sandwich bag out of the garbage, filled it up with water, grabbed a pen and got on stage and put it all in my pocket, and then just tried to manipulate the bag of water. It looked like I was pleasuring myself on stage. It did not pop. I then told the audience what I had been trying to do, and it did not go well. But the guy who won that competition was Mike Birbiglia, who is one of the great.
He was a senior, right, at Georgetown.
He was actually just a year older than me. He was a sophomore, but he won the competition. He saw me bomb, and there are times when you watch a comedian bomb and they bomb funny.
Yeah.
And I think he was like, oh, he bombed, but there's something funny about how this is happening. He's clearly something there. And he invited me to audition for a sketch show that he and some friends were putting on later that year. And I auditioned for it and they cast me. And I went to the first kind of read through of all the sketches in someone's apartment. And I walked out of that read through and it was really one of the few times in my life where I was like, it was one of those moments where it was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I did that sketch show my freshman year, and then I joined the improv group the next year. And from that point on, it was like, everyone here is going to the School of Foreign Service or trying to get a job at Goldman Sachs, or wants to teach, is going into academia, about the history of Russian modernist art or whatever. And I was like, I want to do improv comedy.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because nobody goes to Georgetown University to become a comedian or an actor. I mean, but while you were there, I mean, you're in this improv troupe with Mike Birbiglia. Mm-hmm. A few years later, John Mulaney is a freshman. He's part of the circle. I think Allison Becker also part of the circle. It's unbelievable. I mean, just like this.
it's a very weird time, and I think that's the beauty of it's a weird, and I don't know. I mean, I feel like I'm a fan of your shows and been listening to them, and there's something about the kismet of a moment in time, or like talking about like, well, I grew up with this guy and then we ended up at Yale together and then we created Twitch or whatever it is where and I think it just happened that like, John or Mike or Jacqueline Novak, John Mulaney and Jacqueline Novak were both freshmen when I was a senior, and I don't credit myself. I just cast them because they were both incredibly funny people. While it wasn't a creative school, it was a smart group of people, and so much of comedy doesn't have to be about how well educated you are, but the more information that you can retain, the more source for material or writing style or comedy that you can have. And if you don't need many, and in a weird way, it helped that there were few of us in that we had more opportunities to get on stage. Like Acapella Fest needed a host. We were there. If it just allowed us to get more stage time. Whereas if we were at a classic kind of comedy school like NYU or even like Yale or Wesleyan or all these like very liberal arts driven, schools where kids are going there to do this, there's a lot more people fighting for that stage time or that spot in the newspaper or whatever it is. And we left college with a lot more hours on stage than other people did.
I'm curious about improv. We had Stephen Colbert on the show recently, and he talked about, because this is what he did when he got to college, Northwestern, and he joined an improv troupe, and that really changed his life. And he talks about the process of bouncing ideas off other people and working with collaborators, and how that really was this kind of transformational part of his career, because without that, he wouldn't have been able to kind of advance and progress. Did improv play a sort of similarly important role in, because you weren't a professionally trained, you didn't come from high school theater, you weren't going to Juilliard, you weren't like a kid going to auditions as a teenager. I mean, you were kind of just funny, and this was a thing. But improv now, really, you're kind of bouncing ideas off other funny people. So how important was that to kind of help you develop into who you became?
It's huge. It was hugely impactful, and I think because it does teach you a set of skills that translate throughout everything. There's like, the basic concept of yes and. It's like whatever you are hearing that you are going to say, you're agreeing with that and you're adding something onto it, even if that agreement is to disagree that it's part of this game. They talk a lot about the game of the scene, whatever it is, that you find the funny thing of like that. It's like, oh, this scene is about a guy who keeps drinking iced coffee, but it's clearly a lemonade, but he keeps calling it iced coffee. How do you keep playing that game? It's like, oh, he keeps calling his Ford Fusion a Lamborghini, or whatever it is that you heighten out. And those skills come in handy both in your creative life, and then I have found in your personal life as well. You just want to be able to listen and add on to and collaborate, and it's such a formative tool.
It's so interesting because when we talk about it, it makes me think about, sort of culturally in sort of the business world. I lived on the East Coast in Washington, D.C. for many years. In the media world, no is often the answer that you get, because no is easy. Like, nobody gets fired for saying no to a subordinate. But the idea of yes and is really, and I'm in California. When I moved here many years ago, I was blown away at how yes and is really part of the DNA. I mean, it's a little bit of a stereotype, but it is part of the DNA here. And I think it's one of the reasons why Silicon Valley and all those things happened here. And so when you were in that environment, in that yes and environment, I imagine like you weren't sort of worried about being judged for having stupid ideas. Like, because you could have a stupid idea, but you wouldn't not say it because you weren't worried about somebody saying, "Oh, you're an idiot."
Correct. I mean, look, comedians can be some of the cruelest, most incisively mean people, but especially when you're inside of a format, in a rehearsal or on stage, and it's all about that agreement, and it's all about growing something together. And it's all about sometimes the silliest, most stupid thing becomes the funniest thing. And so much of that, and it's what I credit my improv group with, not only teaching me about improv, but then just finding a group of people who you like to collaborate with. And, I get asked a lot by younger people, how did you end up this? Would you have any recommendations, any piece of advice? And I tell them to take improv, but I also tell them, go do stand-up. If you don't want to be an improviser, go do stand-up, go to open mics. Just find the people that you think are funny and try to be friends with them. Because that is the key, is to find a group of people to, even if you're an individual artist, that you have no plan on being anything but an individual in your field, you need a community around you to help you come to further your ideas, to help support your vision, to do whatever it is. And also just to be physically there with you through these harder times. It's a massively important element to this.
When you first moved to New York after college and eventually you get your first job as a writer on the Chappelle Show, I know you were doing stand-up. I want to ask you about stand-up before I ask you about the writing, which is, how did you break through the fear of judgment? I mean, because you're going out there, you're putting yourself out there, right? And you must have gone through experiences where you really sucked. Like, you walked out of that set and you're just like kind of embarrassed.
Oh, constantly. Open mics, especially when you start, open mics it's a real trial by fire in that you don't know what you're doing. You're literally trying to figure it out, and you're around a lot of other people who are just beginning and don't know what they're doing, or older, or people who've been doing this for a while who have not progressed through the open mic, who are just bad at what they do, and are either totally, either completely jaded by it, feigning jadedness to seem like they're, experienced and road weary. And so you're performing oftentimes at open mics, at least I was in the early 2000s, to 5 or 6 people in the basement of a bar, and bombing constantly, trying to figure out what my voice is, all that stuff, but also simultaneously meeting people who 20 years later, I'm still working with, like my friend Chelsea Peretti, Jesse Klein, and many others who I literally was at these open mics with. And again, that's why I'm saying you really need to find your community, your people, because you're like, I'm going back to this wretched open mic. I need to go with someone, or I need to leave that open mic with someone to talk shit about what we just went through, or to be like, you know what, nobody laughed at that joke, but it's funny, or like, that bit is kind of hacky, like, you need those people. And I think, especially when I started in the early 2000s in New York, there were people doing comedy, but there was this weird intersection with like performance art. So it wasn't just comedians, it was people doing like penis puppetry and people wearing elf ears talking. It was a real, you really, and you'd go in, you'd put your name in a hat, you'd pay $7, and then they would pick the names out of the hat, and sometimes you'd get picked 41st, and you'd be there till like 3 a.m. at a terrible Lower East Side basement waiting to get on stage for 5 minutes.
What was your? I'm thinking about Jimmy Fallon, who from the time he was like 8 wanted to be on SNL, and this is a well-known story. He would watch it and mimic it until he eventually willed it. He became a cast member at like 23, 24. And I know that this was an ambition of yours in your mind when you lived in New York at that time, when you were going to open mic nights and contributing as a writer to the Chappelle Show. Were you trying out? I mean, were you trying to get in front of people at those shows to see if they would consider you?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was trying to get in front of anyone. I was trying to get in front of VH1. This was in the green screen days of Best Week Ever. I finally got on Best Week Ever, but I was doing any VH1 talent person, MTV, like hearing about people on the West Coast getting cast on Punk'd or whatever it was.
Yeah.
I was doing prank shows in New York once the success of Punk'd. I started to get in front of people. you just spend so much time. This is pre-YouTube, pre-social media. There were much fewer venues to get seen and possibly get discovered enough to get yourself in front of X, Y, or Z. But yes, I remember then further in my career, I'd been there 3-4 years, and I finally did a show that Seth Meyers was going to be on, and he was at that point, I think, maybe the head writer at SNL, and I was like, I need Seth to see that I'm funny doing a character and so on and so forth. And Seth is one of the most generous, kind, and I don't want to diminish that he's also incredibly funny, but incredibly generous and kind people in comedy who really is trying to lift people up and elevate people. And I was like, if I'm funny on this show, maybe he'll see me and maybe it'll get in so-and-so's ear to get me an audition. And frankly, that's what kind of happened. I did a show with him, and I don't know, the next time they had auditions, it was the same year that actually John Mulaney, he and I auditioned the same year, as did Jordan Peele. I don't know if anybody has heard of Jordan Peele. Jordan had been on Mad TV, and then they were bringing him into audition. Ellie Kemper was the same year as me.
Wow.
There was a credible list of people.
Auditioning.
And Bobby Moynihan, who's a friend from the Upright Citizens Brigade, also auditioned. He got it that year, and John got hired as a writer. And it was hard to not get it, but I also at that point felt safely like I'm going to have a career. It might not be the dream I had of being cast on Saturday Night Live, but I felt safe at that point. Like, I'm going to work. Like, this isn't the end of this is not the end of my career.
I think it's sort of fair to say, right, your sort of kind of breakthrough opportunity, which was short-lived, was this role in Caveman, right? That was sort of, I mean, that was a network show. You were cast as a lead character in that show. And for those of you listening and watching,
how could you forget the hit show Caveman from 15 years ago?
It was a show about one of the weirdest shows ever. It was a show about like cavemen roommates in New York, and
yes,
and
based on the
day-to-day.
Based on the Geico cavemen commercials, which were incredibly popular because they were these very funny vignettes of these sort of like highly sort of spoiled, cultured guys who happen to also be cavemen.
And there was the caveman lawyer sketch on SNL years before that.
Yes, which is Phil Hartman. Right. Amazing performance. And I came out to LA at that point. This was before I auditioned for SNL. I think I had already, so I did Caveman, and we, I flew out for pilot season. There used to be a pilot season where you'd come out from like February, March, and every network sitcom was holding auditions at the same time, and everyone was running around audition. And I think it was the last audition I went on, and I got cast in it, and it felt like a massive break. It was this really huge
an ABC primetime sitcom.
Yeah, based on these hit commercials, and then I got cast, and then we shot it, and it almost immediately tanked critically, and the joke I like to say is it was. The critics hated it, but what I always took solace in was that the public did also. But
I mean, it's weird because I preparing for this interview, I watched a bunch of it, and
thank you.
It's very weird. I mean, I can't say it's as horrible as people seem to say, but it's been named by some critics as like one of the worst shows on television. This was your big break. When that happened, it was canceled after like 6 episodes, right? And it came in under a lot of criticism. It was just like totally panned.
Yeah.
I mean, that could have been career-ending for you. Were you worried at that point?
No, there were a couple things that happened inside of that little moment that, we shot 13 episodes. It was canceled after 6 or 7. We wrapped shooting the show right as the 2007 writer's strike started. So if it had been wrapped and canceled like it was going to be, and everyone else was going back to work, it might have hurt more. But literally the entire town shut down. And I started what I did right as soon as it got shut down. A friend of mine lived right near me. She was on a show that had been stalled because of the writer's strike as well. This woman, Kat Foster, who a very talented actor, and she and I decided to put on a writer strike sketch show to raise money for the Motion Picture Television Fund, which is a fund for people who work in film and television. So we did a fundraiser for them, and we gathered, the guys from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Seth MacFarlane, and a bunch of other very talented people. So I immediately rolled into just doing a show to do as a fundraiser. It was I felt like creatively I didn't stop.
Yeah.
And I just felt very comfortably like this is going to be, honestly, it was the makeup on Caveman. It was 4 hours of makeup every morning.
Yeah.
I have incredibly sensitive skin. I know it sounds crazy to say out loud, but I have crazy skin. And it was a relief. It was the hardest job I ever had. I look at it as so many blessings in that it was 90-hour weeks in the makeup. I didn't know how hard, because it was my first job, I didn't know how hard it was. Like if you have no frame of reference, you can't complain about it that much because you don't know that other jobs are not this hard. But I learned so much. I learned what every person does on a TV show. I learned how to talk to writers, who to deal with directors, how to deal with the network, how to give notes to wardrobe about what you like and don't like. There was just so many things. You have to do everything for the first time once. Yeah. So there are a lot of blessings behind it that I take.
I watching your character on that show. You really brought that character to life as sort of weird as that show was, and he was like. I watched a day in the life of you as this character doing the press tour for it, and what was remarkable. A couple things are remarkable to me about it. One was you were really young. You were 28, 29, and you were very confident. You really, as an actor, and there was a scene where you go do an interview with like a local TV, and you felt it seemed like you were very comfortable in your skin as an actor, even though you were in 4 hours of makeup. Is that true? Were you all comfortable in your skin?
Again, I go back to being the youngest. I think you oftentimes it put me in a position where I was like, well, I'm always around the older kids, so you have to either fake it till you make it, or you just are. Like I'm comfortable in new situations. Also, in that moment, I always found it, especially earlier on in my career, playing a character, and in this case, under like 5 pounds of latex, it was much easier to be incredibly confident because I was playing this overly confident sort of jerk of a guy who allowed me to go on The View. I went on The View and said in character and talked to Whoopi Goldberg and Joy Behar and Elizabeth Hasselbeck about that some of them didn't believe in evolution, or that, all the stuff that it would have been, if I were just myself, Nick, 29-year-old Nick Kroll, I might have been much more nervous. But because I got to literally hide in under this makeup and be this character, it really allowed me to seem and feel incredibly confident to take some swings that I wouldn't normally have taken.
When we come back in just a moment, how Nick went from caveman to the Kroll Show, and how wandering the streets of New York and following random people around helped him to develop new characters. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz. So one of Nick's early characters was a variation on a guy called the Douche, a recurring role he had on Parks and Recreation. It's an archetype he'd play on several other shows. Obnoxious, overconfident, and hilariously unself-aware. So where did this character come from?
I think it's like, my wife now says I do this thing at weddings. She calls me the behavior police. If like someone's giving a toast and like two people are drunk, kind of making fun of the person or talking over the person giving the toast, I get really upset, and I will oftentimes like shame them for doing what they're doing. And I think I spent many years watching those people, and instead of wagging my finger at them at a wedding. I just was like, well, I guess I think what I'll do is I'll just study them, make fun of them in a very organized format on other people's shows or on my show. I think it became like, I'm just going to watch these people and I'm going to reflect back to them the behavior that I see and don't like, that, both makes fun of them, but also ultimately, like, eventually, hopefully, you're finding some weird humanity inside of them that explains why they're being these, like, douchey assholes.
The characters I think you've described as people who totally lack any self-awareness, that they just don't know or don't seem to be aware of how awful they are.
Yes, who oftentimes think, Mulaney said at one point, he's like, a lot of your characters exclaim how important they are. And I think that's true. I think it's, the lack of self-awareness is something that in real life drives me kind of crazy. People who lack it, but then I find them, because of that, I think I find them very fun to play, and maybe there's something cathartic in it for me to kind of poke fun at their lack of self-awareness.
I wonder when, a lot of writers or musicians will keep like a notepad with them, and they will jot down ideas when things come to them, which will result in a line or a chapter or a verse or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like being the behavior police at weddings, right? And just observing people behaving in ways that you find, a little off-putting. And then that oftentimes or sometimes that behavior becomes a character. How often are you consciously kind of observing the world around you and developing ideas for characters or moments or jokes?
When I lived in New York, it was much easier because it's such a public life, and it's what I miss most about New York. And I think if you look at like the history of film and television from writers and comedians, it's probably a pattern that happens over and over again, which is you start in New York, you live a much more public life, you get access to so much more information on a daily basis of sitting at a cafe or being on the subway or walking the streets or being in a common cafeteria in Midtown, whatever it is. You have so much access to just life coming at you. And then you form your voice, and then you move to Los Angeles because that's where more opportunity is. And then you live in a home or an apartment, and then you drive to work, which is in people who are in your business, and your access to information is limited.
Yeah.
And then you fall back on watching television, watching reality, or at least, and now I'll stop saying you and say me. I moved to LA and started to gather much more information from reality television, or now social media, watching people's behavior in that way. So I miss that about New York. I miss and especially during the pandemic, it was such a weird experience because even any public life was shut down for so long, and you're really limited to the screens and the shows you listen to or whatever. So I have now cherished, like, in the last 6 months, getting back out in the world, going on the road, being in airports, seeing people. What are they wearing? What are they eating? What do they smell like? All those things that just were taken from all of us, but especially if you're someone who builds characters, stories, and worlds based on observation. It also, the more well-known you get, the less anonymous you are, the less you're able to be just a fly on the wall. All of a sudden, people are starting to look at you, which then minimizes your ability to look at them.
Yeah, I mean, I read about the famous characters George and Gil that you and John Mulaney developed. Oh, Hello, these characters that were on the Nick Kroll Show. You literally saw a couple old guys at a bookstore in New York, and then you followed them and just like watched them one afternoon.
Oh yeah, yeah. They were at the Strand bookstore in New York. I think with the joke we had on the show is the Strand bookstore. Their logo or their tagline was like thousands of miles of books and millions of miles of loneliness, or something like was our joke. But it was that you could see these men buying Alan Alda's autobiography, Never Have Your Dog stuff. But then and we watched them, and we would just sit and watch New Yorkers. You just, especially in New York, there's so many of these oh hello guys all over New York. That was so many of my early characters were built on just sitting in New York and watching people.
Yeah, I mean, when you watch that show, which was such an amazing show, the Kroll Show, when you watch it, right, it seems so just effortless, right? Like let's just take one character or one sketch, Publicity, the two Liz's, and you watch those characters, and you're Liz, and then Jenny Slate is the other Liz, and she's amazing. I mean, and what's incredible about those characters is we have all seen that person in real life, even after that sketch existed. Like just in the last year, I've seen that person and have encountered them, and it seems so effortless. It's so funny, but help me sort of break down the actual the effort that goes into coming up with a concept like that and then writing that.
So I had actually come up with that. I was dating a woman when I was getting ready to make the pilot for Kroll Show, and she and I would do those voices to each other as just like a fun around the house thing. And then I went to shoot the pilot for Kroll Show, and we were sort of like, oh, that publicist character, that would be fun to do. And we built this thing around it called Publicity, and it would be a reality show about these publicists and so on and so forth. And it was right as like those kinds of reality shows were really blowing up, and the Kardashians had just started, but also everyone, I mean, we all know them now. And so I was like, great. And I talked to my girlfriend at the time, and I was like, hey, like, we're going to play these characters on the show. And she's like, I can't do it. She had something else that she was working on. And then I wrapped so I then went to Jenny Slate, who I had been friends with for a long time. And I knew she had this kind of voice and character in her repertoire. I had heard her do it, and I was like, oh, great. Well, this Jenny will be perfect. And Jenny was beyond perfect for it. And then I wrapped my pilot, and I visited my girlfriend, and she subsequently dumped me. And so I was like, oh, this is why you didn't want to come back and be on my pilot. But it was fortuitous in that it opened the door for Jenny and I to do these characters together, and for Jenny to be an active part of that show. And she and I, it was, once we started doing it, it's like everything. It's like, if you can set the table, if you prep the meal and you set the table and you invite the right people to dinner, then all you got to do is eat.
Yeah.
Once you're doing it, and that's why, I appreciate you saying what you're saying, which is that it felt effortless, because once we were actually doing it, it felt truly effortless.
I mean, how much of that, I'm just thinking about one specific episode, and anybody can go find this on YouTube, and it's the Liz's are asked to promote yogurt water, something like yogurt water. Yeah. And there's so many, it's just like rapid fire jokes. There's so many, it's hard to even follow them. Like, you laugh at one and you miss one and you laugh at the next one. But there's a line where your character's like, oh, this will be perfect. We should launch it in the most cultured place in the world, London, England, or something like that.
England, London, England.
And I mean, are you writing those lines? Do those lines happen as you are filming? I mean, what do you remember? Yeah.
So in this case, I have a very clear memory of this because the collection of talent on that show was incredibly high. It was and they're all almost every single one of them. If this is a podcast about creativity, I go back to where I started, in that it's all about collaborators. And what I had,
Chelsea Peretti, John Mulaney, Aziz Ansari,
John Mulaney, Jason Mantzoukas, Aziz. Yeah. I mean, it was every person that I had met, from John and all the people I met in college to doing Kroll Show, whatever it was at that point, 12, 13 years later. I'd collected all the funny people that I thought were the funniest and invited them to join me in this show. But that was also off camera. So Jenny Slate and I were doing publicity, and one of our writers was Gabe Liedman, who Jenny and him had come up together in New York, had gone to college together, and he's since gone on to write for Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He has written on. I mean, he's just an unbelievable writer, and he and Jenny were like me and John. We had worked together for years, and he was one of our writers. And so I remember very clearly reading a publicity script that he had written, and it said London, England, AHLGLAND. And so he gave me that gift of in the script writing England, and knowing our voice, knowing the voices that we had created so well. So that particularly London, England was on the page. Now, if you watch the final cut of that, a number of the other things in there are completely improvised. I want something that's medium thick. I want something that's like medium thick. Talking about yogurt water, or I love water, but I want that sour taste that only yogurt can bring, or something like that. Some of that was written, some of that was improvised. Again, it's just like if you set the table right, with the right ingredients and the right people, you can feast.
I mean, you've gone from, and we're going to keep talking about what you're doing now, but from like sketch comedy to characters to your own sketch comedy show, which was heavily influenced by reality TV, then animation, and Big Mouth, and then your newest animated show, which is really just completely. It's so hard to describe. I can't imagine trying to start with that show because I don't know if you could describe it to people.
Sure.
Where do your ideas come from? I mean, do they come in the middle of the night? Is it just one day something happens? Like, how do you come up with a concept for a show?
Oftentimes it's listening to other people. So like I made Kroll Show, and I was shooting The League, and then I made a little independent film called Adult Beginners, and I by the end of season 3 of Kroll Show, I was fully depleted, physically and emotionally, of going back and forth. And so I ended Kroll Show after 3 seasons. We had done 30 episodes, and I stepped it back from the final season of The League a little bit, and I needed to reset. I needed a full reset. And out of that, John Mulaney and I started talking. Mulaney had his show Mulaney had just started and gone away, and I was sort of like, we started talking about Oh Hello, which we had been doing, these characters, these Upper West Side, septuagenarian divorcees who were obsessed with Alan Alda. We had done them very casually. We'd done them on Kroll Show. And we were like, you know what? Let's maybe do a live show of it. And we let it very naturally evolve into what became a play. I think the first version of it was they were on trial for murdering someone with too much tuna. And then it slowly very organically morphed into this play that we took off Broadway. And at the same time, my friend Andrew Goldberg and
who went to high school with you, right?
I went to middle school.
Middle school with him.
I knew him since first grade, and he and I were doing those Wayne's World sketches when we were in middle school. And he had been a writer for Family Guy for, at that point, about 10 years. He and Mark Levin and Jennifer Flackett, a couple who he had known forever, came to me and they said, "What about an animated show about you and Andrew's experience going through puberty?" Being in 7th grade and going through puberty. I was a very late bloomer. Andrew was a very early bloomer. And this juxtaposition of these two boys who are in very different moments in their life physically, but are super bonded and both feeling very awkward. And it just immediately was like, yep, yes, that's it. That's right. And so it was not my idea, but I immediately, sometimes you hear a good idea. It's like, well, that's it. And then we start to work on it. And Andrew and Mark are call me one day, and Jen, and they say, we had this idea that maybe Andrew has like a hormone monster. And I immediately was like, touch yourself, Andrew. And it was like, and that was it. And then it's like, those ideas are so clear. Yeah. And then it became the effort of casting the show and building it out, and who are the other characters. And that's when I start to bring in Jesse Klein, my best friend, my one of my earliest collaborators, and to play Jesse, our girlfriend, or Jason Mantzoukas to play our friend Jay, loosely based on a couple of our other friends from that period of time.
I mean, I think it's sort of plainly obvious and it's going to sound incredibly earnest, but so much of your creative output is connected to the relationships you have. It's like bouncing ideas or just interacting with people or acting with them or just laughing with them or writing with them, and then it just leads to other things.
Yeah, it took me a long time to realize, and it's a luxury that I have because of where I am in my career, that I am a writer, obviously. I've written or been a part of writing, at this point, hundreds of hours of television and content. I barely sit in front of my computer and type anything. I don't write. When I realize that I write verbally, my creative output grew exponentially. My abilities as a writer grew exponentially. When I realized I could go for a hike with a friend and beat out the story of what was going to happen in the next publicity, and then write a few notes in my my notes app on my phone, and then sit down with my writing team and sit down and someone would put it into a format, or John and I would improvise "Oh Hello" on stage, and then we would listen back, or I do stand up and have an idea and get on stage with being like, oh, I think I want to talk about that time I got broken up with. And then it just starts to, I just say it out loud to the audience, and then I record it and I listen back to it, and then I start to polish and find the beats that I want to come back to, discard the things that aren't working. It's when I realized that I wrote verbally like that, my output changed tremendously.
Coming up after a quick break, Nick explains how he sustains his high creative output, why he calls his new material scary, and how he's managed to evolve without losing his edge. Stay with us. I'm Guy Raz, and you're listening to The Great Creators. Hey, welcome back to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz. In the past few years, Nick Kroll's focused a lot of his attention on two new shows he's created, both of them animated, Big Mouth and Human Resources. And all of this has been happening in the middle of a massive cultural shift around comedy, and also changes in Nick's own life.
Yeah, I'm wondering, when it comes to your comedy, I read a review of Big Mouth, and it was a very generous review, and it was basically saying, look, it's not enough just to be vulgar or to for the jokes to be sort of sexually loaded. It has to be funny too. And I'm just curious. I mean, because a lot of your comedy is sort of sexually loaded and vulgar, but funny. Does any of that change as you're a dad? Mm-hmm. And you've got a child, and that child is going to start watching your stuff. Not yet, because he's little, but at some point, I don't know. Does that have any impact on how you think you will evolve as a comedy writer and thinker?
He's in the kitchen right now. I can just heard him screaming from the kitchen, so he might have some feedback for us on this in general. You begin to think about that of but I come from a very strong, big family, and my parents have been coming to see me perform since me and Jesse Klein were doing very vulgar shows in the East Village for 15 people.
Was that uncomfortable to do that in front of your parents?
It was what I realized, it was more uncomfortable for the audience if they knew my parents were in the crowd. So I just stopped telling the audience that my parents were in the crowd. And I was kind of to my parents, I was kind of this is what I do. I'm not going to change that because you're here or because you might be embarrassing to you, and to their incredible credit, they were always, whether they liked it or not, they were very supportive of me and my endeavors. My whole family was. And so, again, you go back to why did you seem comfortable on a talk show? I was it's because I have a loving family. who like made me feel like I could do what I wanted to do. Even when it wasn't good, because they came to shows and they would give me feedback of like, that wasn't very funny tonight. Which I appreciated because I knew it came from a place of love. And also I knew that they weren't always right, or that their opinion of it wasn't, I didn't care about what they thought. But I think, I'm more conscious now. What I'm going to struggle with now, at the older I get, the more I struggle with the idea of artists. An artist can reveal their own foibles, their own issues, but the people in their life didn't necessarily choose to have their issues aired in a public manner.
Right.
And I'm more and more struggling with how I will be an artist who talks about his life without overly revealing my family's life, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know yet how I'll talk about it being a dad if I choose to, while trying to be respectful that my son didn't choose to be talked about.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what I haven't had to cross it yet because he's so young.
Yeah.
But I wonder about that. Like, I have a stand-up. I was touring this hour of stand-up before the pandemic, and then I just shot it as a special for Netflix.
Yeah.
And
This is the middle-aged
middle-aged boy was the
boy,
name
yep.
the name of the tour. And, you know, it was a challenge from my, you know, going back to
because you talk about your life. You talk about stories from your life.
Yeah, and I think it was going back to Big Mouth. You were talking about Big Mouth, and it's vulgar, but the truth is, what I learned doing Big Mouth was you can be. The lesson I found there was the bigger the jokes, the bigger the emotion, the bigger the feelings, the bigger the jokes can be. They really lend each other. So you're either not being just vulgar for vulgar's sake, and you're not being preachy, you know, to let everyone know why we're in the moral right about how we're talking about human sexuality or adolescent development or whatever. They really go hand in hand. And I've tried to take that in, and to be more in that show, I reveal a ton about my adolescence and my shortcomings, my embarrassments, my vulnerabilities, and people have responded to, audiences have responded to that, and I sort of had tried to take those lessons into my stand-up, where I oftentimes had historically played characters it was easier to play a douchebag that wasn't me and know that point of view of that character and could make fun of them. It's much harder to then be honest about yourself and your shortcomings. I'll be honest about myself and my personal foibles, my shortcomings, and my truth. It's much more scary to reveal that to an audience.
I mean, comedy, of course, changes because you know, our society changes, popular culture changes, standards and of behavior change. Like the kinds of things that were funny in the 80s, in many cases, might not be funny today for a variety of reasons. But I wonder, I mean, so many of us have heard stories about how like Jerry Seinfeld won't perform in front of colleges anymore because he's worried about backlash or whatever. Are you? Do you think there's some legitimacy to the fear among some comedians that we've become so overly sensitive about everything that it's becoming increasingly hard to make jokes?
You know, it's something that comes up now often in talking about comedy per se, and this has all sort of come to be while I've been making Big Mouth. And Big Mouth is a wildly dirty show with a ton of we have done and said things that are kind of unfathomable. I won't get it, like the one example I remember the first time we started to have these conversations, like, can you not do this anymore? And I'm like, well, we just did a joke about a boy masturbating at a funeral home next to a casket with his dead grandfather in it. So I'm like, I'm like a little bit like, feels like we can still do and say some pretty crazy things. Now, there are a lot of characters that I played that are on Kroll Show that I would not do today. And because of the current landscape of how things are done.
Because you're portraying characters that were not your race
I'm
agenda.
I'm portraying characters that would be considered not inside of should not be considered part of my wheelhouse anymore. Would I do I regret doing them? No. Are there jokes that I would for sure not do today? Absolutely. Does it bum me out that I couldn't do that character today? Sure, I want to play everything. I want to, but I also am like, fair enough. It's like there's no shortage of things that are funny.
Yeah.
There are no you have to be more thoughtful about the jokes you make than you used to be. You could just sort of like do anything you wanted. But the idea that I just get, frankly, the idea that like, you can't say anything anymore.
That you're limited or right.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just, it's just like.
It's overblown.
It depends on the kind of comedian you are, I guess. Like certain comedians, that's what they do. And they can still do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And they can exist in that space and maybe they'll offend certain people. But if their material is funny and thought out and has great rationale behind it, you can still say what you want, or you can say stuff that will offend the hell out of people and other people are going to be thrilled about it. And those comedians can still tour and have shows and have podcasts and make a really nice living. So I don't fault anyone. I really just try to keep my eyes on my own paper. And in this special, specifically with stand-up, it forced me, I was interested in it because it was time to sort of think about myself more as not, like, I mean, I think about myself plenty, but it was like the place that felt the safest, the target that felt the safest was myself.
Yeah.
And so I turned the mirror, I turned the target at myself, and turns out there was plenty of funny things to talk about.
So how do you, where, I mean, I wonder, given the sort of progressive success you've had, because it hasn't been overnight. I mean, it took you a long time before you got that first role on Cavemen, and it was hard won, right? It took a while for you to, and then you had the show, and then you did some Broadway, and then you have this animated show that's won 3 Emmys, and now you've got this spin-off animated show that's critically acclaimed. I mean, I wonder if you feel, do you feel pressure to just, outperform the next thing? Because I don't know, when you're working on something new, do you get nervous that it might not be as good as the last thing you did?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an underlying feeling of like, I think there's the fear I have, and I'm largely creatively not driven by fear, which I feel very grateful for. But the fear I have is that you have a window where you are at your creative the height of your creative powers, and it doesn't last forever, as we have seen with our favorite writers and comedians and musicians. There comes a point where you're like, well, that person was the best at what they did, and now they're not because they've hit a certain age, or they're too comfortable, or they found other interests, or they have a family, or whatever the myriad of things that to make people not the height of their creative powers. So my fear is that I have a certain amount of time that in my window that and I know it's not infinite. But I think as long as I trust myself to do things that I think are interesting, that are exciting, that feel new, challenges that are like, all right, I was like, well, we're going to make this animated show. Great, that worked. So let's keep doing that. Let's keep building out what that could be. What's the next version of that? And Human Resources, the spinoff, is all about the world of the monsters in Big Mouth, the hormone monsters and shame wizards and depression kitties and anxiety mosquitoes and love bugs and hate worms, all that stuff. It felt like a clear extension of what we were doing with Big Mouth. The lesson doing Oh Hello, which was nobody was asking for a live Broadway show of me and of two like 30 something men playing 70 or something out of touch men. Nobody was asking for that, but it was so fun, and it was undeniably fun to us, therefore worth exploring. I'm doing I've since I mean it won't I don't know exactly when it's going to come out yet, but I've done History of the World Part 2
with Mel Brooks.
With Mel Brooks.
I can't wait. When is that coming out?
It we don't have a date yet, but sometime in the next year, History of the World Part 2. Mel Brooks came to me and wanted to do a TV show of it. And that was like, I mean, that was, again, it was like, well, nobody's a bigger influence on me and my comedy than Mel Brooks. So, and he wants to do this with me, and I can help shepherd this and put this together. It was a no-brainer. Even though it was like, oh, I'm going to go back and do sketch again in a way that, but different than what I had done. The stand-up special, my wife Lily, and we had been on vacation. She was like, why don't you do an hour? This is like 3-4 years ago. And I was like, well, my friends do. I do stand up, but at this point I do it as a hobby. I got all this other stuff I got to do, and I was like, again, I go like, John or Allie or these people are. This is what they do. They're the best at it, and I don't want to. I'm not going to put my hat in the ring for that. And then I sort of was like, you know what? It's been 10 or 11 years since I did a stand up special, and maybe I will commit myself. Maybe it would be a good challenge to go in there and see if I can build an hour of stand-up that isn't relying on characters or anything but myself and being on stage alone. And that challenge has turned out to be a very gratifying one.
You probably don't think of yourself this way, but for obvious reasons, you have become famous, right? You are, and you're recognized, and more than you were 10 or 15 years ago, for sure. Mm-hmm. And even though it sounds like your core friend group is pretty much the same from college and your early days as a stand-up, but you also have, like, your partner, I think, is not part of this world, right? She's like a landscape architect and designer in a completely different non-Hollywood world. How do you just, is it easy for you to stay out of that world, to kind of just not engage and be part of that fame and Hollywood world, or is it?
It's like people are like, ugh, get me away. I mean, I love a fancy Hollywood party. Like you know what I mean? I got no, and I like, I like the biz, like a lot of people. And that said, the older I get and the more my life changes, the less of the nonsense part of it I like. But my wife is a landscape designer and large scale botanical installation artist. And she has exposed me to a whole other world.
I bet you have a nice garden.
We do. She's really into native plants, and
a lot of bees and butterflies.
Truly, and that's the goal. We need a lot of bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds around, and so a Saturday will be me and her and our son going to this native plant nursery in outside of Los Angeles, and picking out and learning about this stuff, and it's really quite, it's really amazing. As a curious person, I want to be exposed to a larger world. I need new information, not to necessarily to make fun of, but and so it's been great. And she's very comfortable in my world, and I'm very comfortable in hers, and we've been integrating them together. I think I've been such a privileged, like, slow and steady growth of success and let's call it fame. It's been so gradual that I haven't had any moment where I was like, oh my God, like what just I never had that moment of like, I walked out one day and all of a sudden everybody knew who I was. It was like, you weren't
Olivia Rodrigo, like going to middle school one day or high school one day, and the next day like being chased down by hundreds and hundreds of teens.
Yes. No, it's been so gradual.
Yeah.
All of it has been so gradual that it's been easier for me to.
Now, when you're chased down the street by hundreds and hundreds of teens, it's not weird.
No, they're angry with me for how season 5 of Big Mouth ended. No, it's and that's the beauty. That's been the beauty of Big Mouth is it has exposed me to a much younger audience of people in them sort of growing with me and being people who wouldn't necessarily have been fans of mine, but with this animated show about youth, they got on board with it and therefore figured out who I was, it feels good.
Do you think that creativity is something that is like accessible only to creative people, quote unquote, or do you think that it's actually something that you can cultivate because you talk a lot about collaboration and obviously you're smart and the people you're around were smart and creative, but I can't help but think that sort of heightens your creative process. So do you think that it's something that can be developed?
I do. I think creativity can be developed. I mean, I think there are certain minds and souls that are creative. They're born, they come out now having a son, having a child, and watching something born into the world that is born with an essence.
Yeah.
That's my limited experience, and I'm sure you, with your children, you've seen it. And then, then that essence is in part formed by the environment that they grew up in, and the parents, the people they had around raising them, or the friends that they make, or the siblings they have, or the teachers they have that help foster that. Let's call it creativity. We're all creating all day if we're listening to each other. Conversation, however you want to frame it, is a creative endeavor. It's all about where you choose to focus that creativity. And I think that's the weird beauty, as everyone talks sort of about the dangers of internet and social media, you have millions and millions and millions of more people who are creating things every day. It's democratized creativity. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of where we are right now. I think the downside is there's a feeling that one has to be constantly creative if you are existing inside of social media, or the idea that I need to constantly be creating or putting out something. I think it doesn't allow for people to take breaks and rest, and I think that's a big part of creativity, is like resetting, like I did after Kroll Show in the League. And you need that. You need to recharge. So when you're planting gardens, and it's in the Bible, you got to like rotate your crops. You got to let your crops sit once every 7 years. You need to recharge. Now that's a luxury that certain people have that other people don't, but I think there is great utility in that, in letting yourself reset a bit to be more creative.
That's comedian, actor, and writer Nick Kroll. By the way, his production company just recently signed a new deal with Netflix that extends them through 2026. You can find some of the comedy sketches we talked about in the show notes for this episode at thegreatcreators.com/Kroll. Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show this week. And if you liked what you heard, we have one small request. Please tell someone about it. Share a link or a tweet or post a story and hashtag The Great Creators. You can find us on social media by searching The Great Creators. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and I'm on TikTok as Guy Raz. So please spread the word. And thanks. This episode was produced by Kevin Leahy and edited by Andrea Bruce with help from Jeff Rogers. Thanks also to Elaine Coates, Jenna Gedman, Nat Hoops, Michael May, Diana Mustak, and Michelle Triant. I'm Guy Raz, and you've been listening to The Great Creators from Built It Productions.